Welcome back to a brand new episode of Tenacious V's podcast. This week's episode features my good friends Will and Johnny again, and we're going to be discussing Inanna or Ishtar. She's an ancient Mesopotamian goddess of pretty much everything, and there's some badass stories surrounding her. We even get to make some connections with our very first episode about Lilith in this one, and it's just super fun all around. You'll notice it's gotten a little bit longer, but we hope that's okay with you, and we really hope you enjoy. Salim, friends, and welcome back to a new episode of Tenacious Bees podcast. I'm joined again this week by Johnny and Will, and this time we're going to be discussing Inanna. Do either of you guys know that name?
No. Yeah, no, I don't know anyone about or anything about this person.
What was their name again?
Inanna.
Now, was this a person from history, or was this like a actual historical figure that we might know? Because it sounds like it may be.
She's a mythological figure.
Okay.
She was a goddess.
Let's see. What's the name again?
Inanna.
Inanna. Is that native to North America?
Mm-mm.
No.
Salim being like coming from the native language, right? So I don't even know.
Celine, is that like Middle Eastern?
It's Sumerian.
Sumerian.
I couldn't find how to say friends, so it's just hello.
Okay.
And it means health. So when you say hello in Sumerian, you're like wishing someone good health.
That's pleasant.
Yeah,
it is. Yeah.
super cool.
It is. That's nice.
So mythological, like a goddess of
Uh-huh.
sorts. Okay.
Oh yeah, definitely a goddess.
Okay, goddess of what?
So she's the ancient Sumerian and Mesopotamian goddess of love, sensuality, fertility, procreation, war, beauty, desire, justice, and political power.
Love and war go together.
All the good stuff.
Yeah.
Everything important.
Everything important.
So like even just through this show, but in general, there's like a big trend of ancient, like the more ancient the goddess, the more dualistic they have more like, or like opposing characteristics. You know what I mean? Like love and death and all that stuff.
I see. So the older back that these myths or gods, like the further back in history they come from, you say the more likely they are to be a deity of certain like things in life, like love or fertility.
Well,
or...
I just mean like they have more duality to them. So rather than just being of like love and beauty and sensuality, it's like love and death and war and birth. You know what I mean? Where it's
like
just like
kindness
opposites.
and aggression in
Yeah.
the same being. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so like I think I've seen it tend to be older, and then as it gets newer, they get more like singular. Or like I don't know, a lot of the times though they blend a lot, and then through the blending they like lose some of the other
Characteristics.
yeah. So like
Okay.
they'll blend with like so many like nice, sweet, loving, happy goddesses that they like lose the kind of like harsher aspects of themselves.
Okay. I see that. Okay.
Yeah. Originally, she's Inanna, but later she becomes known by the Akkadians and the Assyrians as Ishtar. And then the Hittite Saska, she becomes their goddess of fertility, war, and healing.
Yeah, I do know.
That name Ishtar
Yeah.
sounds super
Easter,
familiar,
right?
Yeah, like ESTHER.
It's ISHTAR. Is how this
okay.
is spelled.
It's not spelled.
But she's also, so she's kind of like the original basis for Aphrodite from Greece, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So, just had to throw out, just in
definitely.
case.
Just so you know where we're at, Will.
Well, not you, but just like, people listening. Not everyone knows ancient Greece. I don't know.
Just playing.
But she's actually one of like the oldest written down recorded goddesses, like world over.
Okay, yeah, just throughout human culture.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so this was written down.
yeah, there's like cuneiforms and tablets and like pottery and stuff dedicated to her, like showing depictions of people giving like offerings and things like that.
Was she always, so just going to that specifically, just out of curiosity, um, was she, when she was depicted, was it a humanoid form or was it some sort of representation, like an animal or something like that? Like,
Sometimes she was depicted as a dove, but almost always it was as like a woman with large hips, like clutching her breasts and naked.
okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Very fertile.
Yeah.
Child
Yeah.
Yes, childbearing hips.
She's also been known as the bright star of morning and evening and called the Roman goddess Venus. And before there was a Roman goddess Venus, she was associated with the planet Venus, like because you could see it. And a lot of people thought it was two different stars, a morning one and an evening one, because its location would change. And but she was associated with both of them. So
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
So like an eight-pointed star is one of her symbols, and it's like due to the Venus association, and also because she was called the Queen of Heaven. So it's like a heaven thing.
What could be 8 points exactly though?
You know, I'm not sure.
Okay.
No,
It's an extra fancy star, like an extra fancy heaven. I don't know.
is she, alright, so you said that, I'm gonna keep asking for her name, I'm sorry.
Inanna
Inanna.
or Ishtar, whichever one you want to call her, really.
Are they, okay, so are they a goddess, sorry, deity, that, is worshipped in particular by any sort of like religious group, sect kind of thing, like, or is this like an ancient, like, I mean, just general god that would be worshipped, like, or is it part of like a pantheon that you know of, or is it like a monotheistic kind of like she is the one?
Okay, so
Uh,
yes, there's a pantheon.
okay, so
She
she is part
has
of
like
that.
family members and stuff that are also gods and goddesses. Her brother, Utu, who later became Shamash, is the sun god.
Apollo.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
And then sometimes she's the daughter of Enki, the god of wisdom, freshwater, magic, and like a bunch of other stuff. And then other times she's the daughter of Nana, the god of wisdom and the moon.
So, do you know if this would relate in particular to where in the world they would be worshipped, that these different backgrounds would be like, so you're saying that like they have a lot of different, and not that they have a big family, but it's is what you're telling us. You're telling us that depending on who is like worshiping this person, they have a different background kind of thing. Is that what you're
Yeah,
telling?
so I
Okay.
think it's like I actually don't know which one is which, but there's a Sumerian was like her original worshiping place,
Hmm.
like where she was worshipped, and then she was taken over by the Assyrians and the Akkadians, which were in Mesopotamia. Okay, I can't get very technical about this part. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
But there were two different like cultures that took her image and like her symbolism, and they kind of like melded it to their own culture
Hmm.
in a way. So like when she was the daughter of Nana is when she had the brother Utu, and it was her twin brother. But when she was the daughter of Enki, she didn't have a sibling.
Okay, I see.
Just
So,
slight changes.
yeah,
Yeah.
variations in that. Yeah,
And then like
totally.
almost always she does not have children, but sometimes she has a son named Lulal or Ashara.
Okay.
But like not
What is
very
More
often.
minds like with these
Okay.
people worshiping her. Then like, are these because this is like the goddess of fertility
Hmm.
and love more. So are these like agriculture based like societies and people? Is that like why she's so well known amongst that? Because they, whatever, worshiping the god in order to bring more crops in order to sustain, or like,
Connection of fertility there with like fresh soil and the rebirth of plants and stuff
yeah,
like that. Like,
Um,
is that what you're kind of getting at?
yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
so actually she was made really famous by the Akkadian poet and high priestess Enadwana from like 2285 to 2250 BCE, and she identified Inanna with Ishtar, like she made those synonymous in her writings, and she like brought her up from just a local vegetation deity, so she was like always associated with growing and things like that, but before she was just kind of like a, so I think it was like Ishtar was just like a general like crop deity. You know what I mean? And then this high priestess Enidwana like took her and rose her up to be the queen of heaven. So like her writings are what like propelled her from like together, like that made Inanna and Ishtar the same person, but then it also made her like way more famous, and like that's what kind of began the massive worship of her.
Okay, just like a higher tiered deity in
Yeah.
these circles.
So she was actually like the most popular goddess in Mesopotamia.
Okay.
Like she always gets mentioned in all early lists of the gods, and she's among the four main deities of Anu, Enki, and Enlil. And so she's like the top tier of all the gods and goddesses in Mesopotamia.
Because Anu is the sun god, correct? Or
I believe
what you
it's
said?
Utu.
Utu.
Yeah, Utu was the sun god.
Okay.
And Enki is her father, who is sometimes her father, and he's the wisdom, freshwater, magic, and war god.
Okay.
And
Controls life.
yeah, I don't know what Enlil is in charge of.
Significance, alright.
So there's some like royal inscriptions from the early dynastic period in which Inanna was invoked as a protectress of kings, and she was like especially there behind kings, because like in almost all writings about her one of her main characteristics is her drive for power, and like she is very powerful, obviously, but she just always wants more and feels like she needs more than she's been given. She like backs really powerful, strong kings, and there was a king, the Sargon of Akkad, and he had her support in battle and like politics and things, because like she's also the goddess of political power.
Okay, so she also blessed him, so I'm assuming this is guy, well, the Akkadians, right? And that's what this guy's in charge of. So large player in the culture warsphere, and they're saying that she backed him fully. Like,
Yeah.
Well, this dude's not only a ruler, but he's chosen by the gods. Just like there are so many political powers throughout history, but backed by one of the most revered gods of what's going to keep us sustained and keep us safe, because she's, the goddess of war and like crops. So it's like everything you need to keep a community going. So I feel like that would make the people definitely buy into that, right?
Oh, absolutely.
That's pretty crazy. So, I mean, it's not that crazy, because it's always been like that, right? Just,
I feel like for multiple different cultures and religions, they're going to have very similar kind of, I'm not trying to say that they're not standing out. I'm just saying that, like,
yeah, just that it's God's backing the rulers. It's a good way to stay ruling.
Oh yeah. Well, and this, like I said, she influenced Aphrodite and all sorts of other goddesses, and she actually ends up like enveloping all sorts of local deities and things from other villages and like regional areas. And so she, like, a lot of things are based on her, you know what I mean? And it's like, of course, a lot of the culture and the religion is gonna kind of carry over, as well as just things to do with her, you know?
so out of curiosity, kind of like with certain other myths, for example, the myth of Persephone.
Okay.
Okay. Going down into the underworld and with Hades and everything. Is there a specific story with
So glad you brought this up.
that we might be able to recognize that is kind of like similar or like
Yeah.
there is.
Yeah.
Okay, that's cool.
There's actually one like almost exactly like the one that you just mentioned from Persephone going to the underworld.
Do tell.
So yeah. So there's four main myths involving Inanna, and they're called the Inanna and the Hulapu tree, and it's an early creation myth, and it's in the Epic of Gilgamesh.
No shit.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's that one, and then there's Inanna and the God of Wisdom, where she brings knowledge and culture to Uruk, which is the main city where she was worshipped. Like that was the big capital of the. Oh, to answer your earlier question, her religion was called the cult of Inanna Ishtar.
Okay.
Like it was depended on it was the cult of Inanna or the cult of Ishtar.
Ishtar. Okay.
But yeah.
Okay.
Because she like tricked Enki into getting drunk and giving her the gifts of like wisdom and knowledge and stuff, so she like went and gave it to the people. Then there's the courtship of Inanna and Dumuzi, which is the tale of her marriage to the vegetation god. And then there's a poem which is the descent of Inanna, and it's a story of the Queen of Heaven traveling to the underworld. So, yeah.
Right on. That's okay, cool.
Yeah.
Yep.
There's also three long. I'll get to the story.
No worries.
But there's also three longer, more intricate hymns written by Enadwana, the high priestess, and they're to honor her personal goddess and the patroness of Uruk. So they're called Inan Sagura, Ninmisara, and Inan Mehusa. And they mean the great-hearted mistress, the exaltation of Inanna, and the goddess of the fearsome powers.
I like that last one.
Yeah. Super cool.
Yeah.
So those are the ones the three I just mentioned are the writings that influenced the Mesopotamians to like treat her as the Queen of Heaven and raise her up and hold her in such high regard.
Okay.
Um,
So, would you be able to enlighten us as to some details onto these four
Yes.
tales that you were telling us about?
Yeah. It seems pretty important if it changed the entire culture's understanding of the goddess.
Yeah.
Well said.
Oh, I don't actually have pieces of the three poems, but I have the other main stories
That's fine.
and those are from the Sumerian myth. So those are from her like original.
Yeah, from as Inanna before Ishtar.
Yeah. In the Akkadian version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, Inanna asks Gilgamesh to be her consort, and when he says no, she just like unleashes the bowl of heaven, which kills Enkidu, and she causes Gilgamesh to like grapple with mortality. So I think that's ultimately like what leads him to become immortal, like force himself to become immortal.
Just
like
because
her.
he had to realize that he was immortal.
Yeah, like she could kill him and stuff, but it was I don't know. That just shows her like intense.
Yeah, just her drive.
Pretty extreme power too.
Absolutely. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But so the most famous myth is the one where she descends into the underworld, which is called Kur in ancient Sumeria, and she goes to conquer her older sister Ereshkigal. I don't know. I couldn't find much about Ereshkigal, but she's the queen of the underworld.
It's because she got her ass beat.
Yeah.
No.
So not gonna write history.
There's
That's right. The winners don't write. I mean, the winners write history. That's what.
Damn straight. But there's 7 judges of the underworld, and they're called the Hubris. But they deem her guilty, and they strike her dead on the spot. And so she has to stay in the underworld, and she's trapped there. But 3 days later, one of the gods goes and pleads with all the other gods to bring her back. But everyone's just like, nah, we're
Not
good.
about it.
Like, she could just stay down there. It's cool.
Really? Wow. They just turned their back real quick.
Well, except for her father, Enki. So he's like, okay, like, yeah. And so he sends these 2 sexless beings to save her. I don't know why, but that seemed very important because it was repeated like the same way in like 3 different stories that I read. So
They want to mess around with the daughter.
I guess. But so they succeed, but the guardians of the underworld called Gala, they're just like not fucking having it, and so they take her husband Demuzid to replace her, and he's just stuck down there now. So now she's just like alone in heaven. Like, fuck, man, my husband got dragged down to the underworld. So then eventually, um, Ereshkigal is like, okay, well, I guess if I can have your sister, Geshtinana, for half the year, then you can like live here half the
Oh
year,
shit, it's very
and
close
you
to
can live there half the year.
It's very close to
Yeah. So then
Persephone's tale. Okay.
Yeah.
that results in the cycle of the seasons.
Oh, look at that.
Yeah.
Exactly what it is.
Right?
I know stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean that still just plays into like a lot of our things, just because like, I am just going off of like my bit of the fertility thing, being that definitely just seems to play into it because the seasons are a big part of that. So of course
Yeah.
I agree with that.
she'll
Totally.
be that. So I mean it just seems to add to her attributes of
Well, it's actually really interesting because as far as like fertility and love and beauty goddesses go, she's like one of the only ones, particularly fertility. She's one of the only ones like ever that was not like a mother figure. And it's not just that she like doesn't usually have children, it's like she's not like seen as a mothering like woman. You know what I
Nurturing
mean?
kind
Yeah,
of
she's
thing.
like just
'Cause-
kind of like she's kind of hoe a little bit.
But I feel that with the whole fertility thing, it would be,
Yeah,
I
like
mean, reasonable for somebody to make the assumption that it would have to do with.
and like usually it does. Like a lot of the time, fertility goddesses, like in Egypt and stuff, there's two different god. I can't. Hathor's one of them, but both of them are associated with like mothering and like
Very nurturing.
nurturing
Yeah.
and fertility, whereas she is not associated with that. She's more associated with like power. Like she'd be a Slytherin.
But
I
like
got
what
you.
you
It's
were
like what a
saying,
woman, like
Yeah,
that type of thing, like getting it done.
her physical like form depicted as like a humanoid though, like you said, seems to be like the image of like a fertile woman.
a
Of,
fertile
like,
woman,
yeah, like
but
that,
not
which is
necessarily a mother.
doesn't necessarily mean you have to be mothering for fertility, and I feel like that also plays into the agricultural side because like just because like you can there's ground that can be farmed that's not necessarily like the best place to be, but it's not always just comforting. But it is like livable. I mean that
Yeah,
really is.
yeah.
So and I mean yeah, also if you're gonna be the goddess of war, I feel like that generally doesn't go along with being a mothering figure and more of a violent
Yeah, yeah,
thing.
It's pretty
definitely.
assertive. I mean,
Yeah.
not to say that mothers aren't, but to say that it's a different type of.
Yeah, a little bit more like it's you know.
She was known as the enforcer of divine justice, and one time she destroyed Mount Ebby for challenging her authority, and then she unleashed her anger upon her gardener for raping her in her sleep and killed him. And then,
That's fair.
yeah, I mean, I agree. She
Wow.
also tracked down a bandit woman named Belulu and just like murdered her as retribution for murdering her husband. She was pretty like I said earlier, justice, political power, justice.
Also seems to be just personal vengeance.
Oh yeah,
I don't know if that's
she
necessarily
seems
justice.
very
Yeah.
vengeful for sure.
I don't think that necessarily coincides with justice all the way, but maybe for the time, and that's the lesson that they wanted everyone to take from it was like, yeah, well, just don't fuck with me, otherwise I'm gonna fuck you up, kind of thing. And it's just,
Yeah.
your life's gonna be a lot better if you just leave people alone. Like,
Yeah.
and I don't know. That's I think our ideas of justice, at least in the modern world, is like a fair trial, and like even different gods have been known to like trial certain, I guess, offenders. Whereas this is just like, nah, man, you judge, jury, and executioner.
Yep.
So that's
Yeah, cut out the middleman.
She just does it all
get
herself.
Yeah, I feel like the gods that generally throughout history have done that, like Odin and Zeus, generally not seen as justice-worthy gods.
Oh fuck no.
I would not use those words. All powerful.
All powerful.
All powerful, definitely.
I mean that's interesting, but people just kind of were like, yeah, right, that's works for me.
Yeah. There is a story which I really like, and it's from the Epic of Gilgamesh again, But this is like kind of before she's all powerful. This is when she's still kind of like a young goddess and like hasn't really got the full grasp of her like scope of powers yet. And there's this tree and it's called the hulabu tree. And so like this is the one I mentioned earlier. But it could be a willow is what they think. She wanted like she took the tree from where it was growing and brought it to like her property basically, and she wanted to like grow it into a full-size tree and then make it into a throne. But there was these like terrifying creatures that lived in it. There was like a night owl and all these spooky things, and also Lilith, who was episode one.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And so she is like too scared and like won't do anything. So she like basically hires Gilgamesh, the hero, to come and like scare off all these creatures for her and just like get rid of them. And so he like comes and scares off Lilith and the other creatures.
Oh, that's a fun story.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Well, throwback, callback. Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah. Alright. You guys want to hear something crazy though?
No.
So, well, you're hearing it anyways. So she was literally worshipped for 5,800 years. Like,
Fuck.
pretty majorly. So it started in 4000 BC, and then,
Take that, Jesus.
Yeah.
yeah.
So that passes 58. So 4,000.
So 4000 BC to the 18th century is
The
like
the 18th century or
the 18th
1800.
century. Isn't
That's
that crazy
insane.
though? Yeah.
So from 4,000 BC to okay, so 5,700 years.
Is how long she was like pretty majorly worshipped in at least parts of Upper Mesopotamia.
So just off the top of my head, I feel like that would be somewhere.
It's the Middle East. It's the Fertile
Yeah.
Crescent. It's in the Fertile Crescent because that's like this is the start of known society.
Mm-hmm.
Is all of this Sumeria and all that. So it is over there. I'd like to see where it, Fertile Crescent, and now it's Iraq, Kuwait area. So like
Okay.
right there in the heart of the Middle East. So it is right in the Fertile Crescent. So I guess we'll go back to that. 5,700 years of worship, mostly in the Fertile Crescent
Yeah.
area, and that's a long time to keep this polytheistic kind of worship, especially with the rise of Christianity.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I don't think it was from a polytheistic religion. You had said that there was multiple, that it was, or polytheistic. It was
Yeah,
multiple
yeah, not
gods, so it's not
monotheistic. Yeah,
monotheistic.
Yeah,
You-
not
okay.
monotheistic.
Whoops.
Yeah,
Sorry, I didn't.
No, you're good.
That.
You're good, and I think that's it though too, because I mean, like after the rise of Christianity, especially in
Right.
that time, like up to that point, I mean, we're getting towards the beginning of the United States of America. We're getting to that level of like Christianity. There's already been the Crusades.
Totally.
There has been like what else we did like so many different
Martin Luther's
Yep.
Reformation.
Yeah.
King's Bible, I believe.
Exactly.
If I'm
So
not mistaken, but I could be.
no, you're right, and that's all a way of just like so even sects of Christianity and
It
that
outlasted
spread has
all of those.
So
has
she
still lived through
she
that.
did start to decline from the 1st to the 6th century, but like you still have to think about that. It took 600 years for her to decline enough to, you know what I mean, to like not
Right.
be a major religion, and that's what it meant by like the decline, where she was still worshipped and there was still like a actual cult of Inanna at that point until the 1700s, but it was diminished. It wasn't like a major contender, you know what I mean?
Right,
Like,
right.
but yeah, and it took 600 years of Christianity to even decline it, you know what I mean? To take it off the map.
Yeah,
So that's like a pretty intense fight right there.
That's definitely like has definitely made a lasting effect on, I imagine, many culture.
Mhm.
Like,
Absolutely.
yeah, definitely.
This is funny because I was looking around just the other day and I was just fucking with Google really and asked like what is the oldest religion that's still standing right now?
Mhm.
And so from just what I gathered there is that it's Hindu is the oldest religion now. So does that mean that this has fallen off like pretty much entirely and now is just considered mythology? Or
Maybe that, and I don't know if nowadays it would be considered a religion necessarily. Like, I do think it's considered a cult now, but it would have been their, like, like kind of how the Druids in Ireland and England and Scotland and stuff, they were, like now we kind of consider that like a cult, but then that was their way of worship. That was like,
I mean, but I would like to point out, I feel like this group, like, I'm sorry to interrupt, but
no,
like, sincerely, I feel like this group, just like the Druids, that whole idea of a cult, we, in our age and like generation, we don't really have that perception of cults. When we think of cults, we think of
Manson.
Manson
Yeah.
cult or Jim Jones and things like that, as opposed to this was like for um, the betterment of this like culture society. Whereas not not saying that Jim Jones and Charles Manson didn't think that it was for the betterment, but like this actually had 600 years of a lasting effect as opposed to one outstanding incident
hmm
where they were declared as a cult and where like it got this negative connotation where as the Druids and the cult of Ishtar
hmm
would be more like a positive um, kind of cult, I guess, than,
Well,
for
and
lack of a
it's
better
kind of
like.
more like how the Egyptian religion was, how it was like it's not necessarily like organized. Like you don't go to like church every day. You don't have like
Sure.
a formal type of worship for everyone.
Okay.
But there's like high priestesses and high priests, and those people are kind of the ones who are like doing the worshiping consistently, and they're like there's temples and they're upkeeping the temples and things like that, but it's not really like it's definitely different from like a modern religion.
So it's not governing; it's more like guiding. Like it's more of a. It's not like a these. This is the rule set. It's more of this is the general idea, and this is guidelines as to how. These are things that you should take away from these stories of, and this history of.
Uh,
No.
kind of yes
Okay.
and no. Like it gets a
Okay.
little more into it than that,
Sure.
but
So, alright, a little bit more into it than that. Like, how so?
well, okay, I'll get into it. So she has like so many changing names, and it's changed so. I'm gonna like kind of answer it roundabout. But a lot of scholars that study ancient Sumerian like culture and everything are like really confused about like what her origin is exactly and like where she came from in particular and like why she is so multifaceted. And there's like two main theories for that, and one of them is that she's the result of like multiple like previously unrelated deities, and they kind of just like took them and were like, we don't need to have these seven. Let's just make one that's like kind of more powerful, you know, and kind
That's
of made it like
understandable. Is the right word amalgamation? Is that the right?
yeah, yeah, like an
Okay.
amalgamation of different deities to
Okay.
make her. So think like Ragnar Lothbrok in Vikings, where like there are like three or more like historical Viking kings that like could have been Ragnar, but we think that it was all three of them combined into one story that like gave us Ragnar Lothbrok as a king. So he might not have like he might have been a real historical person, but like especially with all the things he accomplished and how far he traveled and everything, it's more likely he was multiple different people.
So it's
Okay.
uh,
Collective accomplishment.
kind
Yeah.
of like the Bible, if you will. Like it's like a bunch of different like uh, people with like different ideas of like this story that was written by multiple people over multiple periods, and they're all kind of coming together to like I guess write, create, understand like this one idea, whether it's the God themselves or the following religion story of it. Like it's are you kind of saying that it's pieced together like that? Like
Well, so it would be more like so the people would have like built up their pantheon slowly and like added more gods and goddesses as they had things they needed blessed and whatnot.
Mhm.
and then it would have gotten to a point where they had too many, and they probably, like, a lot of cultures would have, like, been like, okay, well, the goddess of fertility and the goddess of crops and the goddess of spring can all be the same goddess.
I see.
And
Okay.
so, like, that's kind of what happened, where they were like, okay, well, there's this one, this one, this one, this one, and this one, but, like, realistically, those can fit into the same being, so let's just make it one.
I see. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Alright.
So then the other theory says that she was originally a Semitic deity who was brought to the Sumerian pantheon after it was, like, already fully created, and then they just kind of gave her any role that wasn't already filled. So it was like they didn't have a war god yet, and they didn't have a fertility god yet, and stuff like that. So they were just like, here's these roles, you know, and they just kind of like gave them to her.
Well, that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Just adding stuff onto the busy woman's plate.
See, I think that one's less likely, though, because she does have such important roles, you know what I mean? Like, she is war and fertility. Like, those aren't roles that you give out last. Those are going to be, like, some of the earlier gods that you'd fill in, you know what I mean? So it doesn't make sense to me that she would come into an already fully formed pantheon and get important roles. Like, she would have been a lot less important, you know, just like...
The god of wind.
Yeah, like, of just, like, silly things, like the god of climbing a mountain, and, you know, it's like...
We're going to all go back to the cult of Ishtar, or at least Ishtar herself. Because it is Ishtar, isn't it?
Ishtar or Inanna, yeah,
Inanna.
those are the two names. But I don't know, yeah, so then, like, either way that it happened, that she was, like, originated, her rise to fame included her just, like, absorbing all sorts of regional deities who were like, I have a list.
And we mean this literally? Like, she...
No, she didn't, like, eat them, but she,
Okay.
like, so,
Not that far out
in
there.
ancient religions like Greece and Rome even, a lot of the smaller, like, towns that weren't necessarily connected to a big city in a big way would have, like, the main gods. Like, they'd have, like, a few of the main ones that they worshipped, but then they had their own gods for, like, the more minor stuff that were just, like, regional, and they
Like
only
demigods.
existed there. No, they were like the same. They were just only in that one place. They just didn't
Okay.
exist outside of that village. They kind of just, like, came up with more specialized gods, I guess you could say.
Sure.
So
Okay.
it was like those types of gods that she just became them. Like, so she just, like, took whatever role they had in those villages, and, like, that was just hers now.
And you said
And
there
that
wasn't a
one went
maternal
away.
factor to her, but I think that's a very maternal thing to take in all the unwanted, unused things taken upon themselves.
I got this,
Take
guys.
that extra weight, that extra burden.
But it's not, though, because you got to remember, she always just wanted power and more of it, so she was really just seeking, like, she just was taking on everything that she could get her hands
Okay.
on, kind of.
More responsibility could be considered more power.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's more like the transition from, like, Greek mythology to Roman mythology, where it's almost, you see just such heavy similarities, but
Yeah.
we're just changing names. And
That's where I'm
changing
getting the
slightly.
connection there.
And,
That's,
like,
yeah.
a big thing that they did there, too, was, like, to make, because a lot of, like, when they were changing from Greek to Roman, like, to make their pantheon more famous, they would make them get rid of their regional deities and replace them with, like, Aphrodite and stuff like that. So it was, like, that was kind of a big deal, because they were, like, keeping, sometimes they would even just be keeping, like, main gods and goddesses, and they would just be like, nope, you can't use that anymore, like, that's now this person. And so it was kind of like a forced thing to gain popularity, and I think that's, like, kind of part of this, and it was, like, comes from the writing, too, where she would write, like, oh, and she does this and this, and then people would be like, oh, well, now we have to associate spring or, fertility or war with this lady instead of, like, this deity that we were worshiping before.
Okay.
So I don't think it was always necessarily, like, fully chosen.
Okay. Huh. Well, yeah, you've got a lot of time to do that in the 600 years it was said, it was established that this...
The 4,700 years she was worshipped.
4,700, sorry.
Yeah.
5,700.
Yeah.
Way past the
Oh,
5,700.
5,700.
Whoa,
Yeah.
I was way off.
It's a long time. It's a lot of, and I mean, yeah, because it's really easy, like over that course of time, to just slowly implement it and just kind of drip feed it until it's just accepted.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, and it didn't even have to like coercion from the bigger like the bigger cities and the more politically powerful people back then was like meant a lot. It was kind of like their words law. And if they like if everyone wanted you to worship Inanna or Ishtar or what have you, like that's what you were doing.
big part of war.
So
Yeah, totally.
I see, like, and especially if I get that would make sense why she'd be the deity of war. If a big part of it was, was them forcing this new thing on people, and then and that's who is your main goddess that you're exposed to. Like, well,
mhm.
definitely war right
Yeah,
there.
for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's war in itself, really.
War on fate.
Yeah.
So if you want to go back a little bit, I can get into the actual practices of her like worshippers a little bit more.
That sounds interesting. So, yeah. So this is like something that's happened through all this time. Like that's been what very similar to as she has taken on all these
Um,
different roles with the worship. Is it something that it's like through time, different kind of, I guess, uh, followings, ways that people like study or practice this religion? It's been like developed, I imagine, similar to the way she's taken on these roles of. It's just been like progressively like.
I think it's definitely evolved and like continued pretty regularly, and I don't actually know when the actual practices would have stopped or how they evolved and changed. These
Okay.
are kind of the more ancient bits, though.
Blood sacrifice?
No.
Oh,
Oh.
okay. All
So
right, let's hear it. No, just kidding.
she androgynous and hermaphroditic men were like heavily featured in the worship of her. And during the Sumerian times, she had priests in her temples known as Gala, Gala, who they worked doing elegies and lamentations, and they took female names and spoke in MSL, which was a dialect reserved only for women.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Secret society.
And then they
Actually,
also
women power,
allegedly
oh
partook in some homosexual relations.
God. They didn't back then.
Yeah. But
Going back to the Romans and Greeks.
Yeah, exactly.
I
That's
told you
part
they
of it.
took more than just the names. And
Yeah, there you go.
Took all the fun too.
But so then
Got 'em.
during the Akkadian period, there were servants of Ishtar who were called the Kurgaru and the Asinu. They were men that wore women's clothing. There we go. And
Yeah.
and so then they did like war dances in her temples. So the Akkadians were more kind of like focused on her war driven side, and so they were more focused on the war dancing and the like kind of preamble to that.
Hell yes.
And they were also known to the gay sex.
Hell yes.
Hell yes.
There's an Akkadian hymn that even says Ishtar transforms men into women, and that's like her thing.
It's her thing. Does she have a
So,
reason for that, or is it just something she liked doing?
I don't know. It's just
I like
maybe
to
she's
drink
helping
beer.
them
She
come
just
out.
likes to turn men into women. Cool.
I don't know.
Well, I'm sure that there is. It's probably, when we think about it, something having to do with culture and identity, very similar to many native tribes here in America. When there would be up to 4 or 5 different identities sexually that someone could identify as, and it has to do with the culture and like the upbringing. And I imagine that this was like a very similar situation
Okay.
where it's like instead of weakening your community by dividing people, maybe it's something where it's like
it made them holy and kind of strengthened that, and they weren't like targeted.
instead of singling them out to ridicule or chastise them, maybe it's singling them out to praise them.
The God has
maybe-
changed you. The God has
Right.
seen you.
And maybe
for
not
this.
praise them, but maybe like
Well, no,
single them out to
they
honor.
were held in, definitely honored.
In a high regard.
They were, because they were like the keepers of her temples, so it was like a pretty big deal.
Okay.
That's
They
super
were
cool.
a pretty big deal.
Yeah, that is super cool, actually.
So there's also, starting at the end of the 3rd millennium, kings of Uruk used a special ceremony to establish legitimacy, and the ritual was a full night, and it was on the 10th day of Akitu, which is an ancient Mesopotamian festival of spring celebrated on the equinox. And the king would take the role of Dumuzid, Inanna's shepherd husband, and then there would be a sacred marriage ceremony during which the king would sleep with the high priestess of Inanna, who was like embodying her for that night. So it was like the king became Inanna's lover, and you know what I mean? Like they did like a sacred marriage,
The whole
so like
ceremonial
she
thing.
would be like brought in and backing him, and they had her political power and her backing in war.
Okay, so yeah, it was actually like a whole ceremony about it. Nah, I mean, that's pretty cool, though.
There's a modern debate, actually, if it was an actual fact or if somebody invented it for like a literary thing. Like, people don't know. It's like debated right now if it was real or not, the ceremony.
The whole ceremony, like, in order to have sex with these women, obviously, it's like, what's happening there? But, like, there's a debate on if that was just someone just made that up in order to make their story more interesting about this tale.
Yeah.
That's,
Sounds like religion to me.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Skewing it to fit your needs. I mean, I don't know, but like, kind of like.
No, it's also definitely.
By the way, there's this rule.
Yeah.
This is another thing. By the way.
Well, and it kind of just seems
religion.
like somebody was writing things down to make it seem more like one of those sketchy, creepy sex cults, because it was also
Catholicism.
written that there was like.
Sorry, I got a little off topic.
Not at all.
Not at all.
I think I got a little off topic.
But yeah, some people like said that they engaged in sacred prostitution, meaning the priestesses of Ishtar or Inanna, and modern historians, like actually looking into it more legitimately nowadays, don't believe that to be true, and they don't think that they were engaging in any sort of like prostitution acts, especially not in service of Inanna or Ishtar.
So, sacred prostitution. What you're saying is like, so at one point these people were saying that these women would sell themselves or sell their bodies, whatever, in order to pay like towards the church, or what made it sacred? What was the payment that made it sacred?
I kind of think it was they had to give themselves to certain people that were like kind of holier, like maybe kings or the priests or something like that, like someone that was in power and male, or like.
Well, just out of curiosity, would that be something that is done in penance, like as something they've done that was
I
wrong?
don't know too much, guys.
Okay.
Sorry, I did not research the sacred prostitution specifically too much.
So we're really looking into that, guys.
You guys are super into that.
It's a very strong thing to accuse someone of, and it's
Isn't it?
I would say that it warrants
inquiry.
Yeah. Thank
So
you.
that's probably not real though, and that's why I didn't look into it too much, is because it's like more than likely that never happened, and that wasn't a practice ever engaged by legitimate people of the cult of Ishtar.
So it's a popular bastardization by other
Just
cultures or religion to
Yeah.
There you go. Okay.
So one way that women in the area that she like had control over, though, like where she was worshipped, they worshipped her by baking cake in ashes. And then they have found like many clay cake molds that are shaped like naked women with large hips clutching their breasts. So they think that they are like actual like depictions of Inanna, and they'd bake cakes in them and like leave them out as offerings for her.
I would definitely accept a cake that looked like me.
With actual cremated ashes instead of cake?
I couldn't figure out what kind of ashes. I think just ashes from the hearth of the fire,
Okay,
because
so
those are
not
like
like
a fertility thing, and they're like a woman's thing.
okay. See my yeah, my confusion there was I was like understanding that it was like when these priestesses, for example, if they might have passed, if they were cremated and their ashes were baked into these cakes to pass on this,
I don't
like,
actually know, but that's like a really interesting thought for sure.
I mean, just,
Yeah.
you know, I have no
Yeah,
idea
no.
where I came up with that, but
I like that.
that was,
Well, just I feel like the word cremation just immediately kind of sparks that thought of it. Like,
I never said cremation. I said ashes. He said.
oh,
I said cremation, yeah, it's because, like,
Well, yeah, and
the
because
ashes
I
burnt in
really
the
don't
cake
know
or
what kind of
cooked into the
ashes. Like
cake.
it definitely could have been like maybe they did it when it was the ashes of a loved one, and they hoped that she would give them like better favor in the afterlife, or like I'm not sure. It could
For
have been
sure.
anything like
But
that.
even with what
Okay.
you brought up with like the hearth of the fire, because in a lot of cultures the hearth is part of the home, which is a very, you know,
Woman, fertile, yeah, and it like you can use it to feed like crops and stuff, which like again fertility, like
but less of that go-getter warlike attitude. That
yeah.
it was very
So that's an
Okay.
interesting thought. Like it
I didn't
definitely
know
could
any
have
of
been
this.
ashes of loved ones. Like
Yeah.
that's really interesting.
that is all that's super cool though. I didn't know any about that.
not at all. Yeah, this
So-
is yeah,
I
definitely a new one.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think
for
she's
sure.
super cool. There's like a ton of information that I didn't even include here because it's just so fucking much, you know. You know, like 5,800 years worth of information.
He's got something. Yeah, he's got
You
some
know.
stuff. He's got
Things
something
tend
to
to
say.
change
Yeah.
up a little bit
Yeah,
too. So
for
there's
sure.
so
That's
much
true.
variation. You could, I mean, I feel like we could sit here forever and discuss it.
Oh
But,
yeah. So I have two quotes from Sumerian hymns about Inanna, if you guys would like to hear those.
Absolutely.
Alright, so the first one states, when the servants let the flocks loose, and when cattle and sheep are returned to the cow pen and sheepfold, then, my lady, like the nameless poor, you wear only a single garment. The pearls of a prostitute are placed around your neck, and you are likely to snatch a man from the tavern. So that one's showing kind of a hoe.
Also, that the
And-
prostitution thing may have been legitimate. It seems like it's kind of a sacred thing. Give you the pearls of the prostitute.
Yeah, but it's also showing like because how I said earlier, she's never been associated as like a mother figure or anything. She's also never been associated to marriage. Like she had a husband, but she also had consorts. Like he wasn't her only lover.
Something I'm getting from this is poem, this hymn, is that after the busy day, go and worship the strong woman. Kind of what I'm seeing there is that after your day of labor, you go and
Get laid. Go pick up a man
well,
from the
not
bar.
me.
No, she's gonna get you laid. She's gonna come pick you up from the tavern.
Like she's
You
the
get a drink and you get laid.
like. Am I just being like
I feel like I
totally way off here, or is like am I kind of like because that's just my
feel like I'm on the same
interpretation of
page.
Yeah,
how
no,
I'm
yeah,
picking up on this. And well, I mean, if anything, that is reason to worship. I mean, not saying. What I'm saying is that like you put in your labor and then you reap the reward of being invigorated and you know
Yeah, like you get that
You get-
nice lady.
you get that from you
The
know
cycle
and
of
if
life,
anything
the whole
it's from a
total.
goddess and
Yeah.
you know it's but I mean it may just be sounding asinine right now but I really don't know.
I mean, who doesn't want to have a goddess as a wingman? That's really like
Totally.
what I'm
Killing it.
Yeah, like, that's kind of what it seems like. You work hard and I got you.
I'm down with some cults.
Yeah, I'm about it. So another hymn about her like war deity aspect, and this one says that she stirs confusion and chaos against those who are disobedient to her, speeding carnage and inciting the devastating flood, clothed in terrifying radiance. It is her game to speed conflict and battle, untiring, strapping on her sandals.
That sounds like most war gods throughout history. I mean, even Jehovah, who's not considered like a war god, but is obviously God's on our side, kind of thing.
I was gonna say that sounded to me when I heard it like something that could come out of Art of War, wherein instilling disruption among the ranks of the enemy. Um, just the way I heard that, the way you read that, to me it sounded like I immediately thought like tactics, like battle. Like,
Well, yeah, and then like you think back to her like releasing the bowl of heaven upon Gilgamesh for not wanting to consort with her, you know,
Right.
and so it's like it shows that she's like not only is she game for war and she's gonna lead you into that shit, but she's also vengeful as fuck,
right,
and
like
that's gonna show through as well.
And what I was kind of picking up there too, because when you say disruption like that and bringing the floods, like it's just the natural forces that can tip the scales of war. That a big part of that, just like how the Nazis were unable to penetrate like the
The
USSR because of the
Russia,
cold, and so
yeah.
like that was on their side,
Yeah,
for sure.
and so it's just
Russia's
like
always had that advantage, though.
yeah,
Totally off
always,
topic, but
yeah,
always had the
yeah,
advantage.
fucking base Russia.
It is. It's the fucking advantage of nature, though, and that's like the disruption that she's able to. So it's not just like a flat out. She's here with you, and you're a better fighter. It's just like, but the scales of nature will be on your side.
mm-hmm.
There's more than one way to skin an animal, and that includes war.
It's definitely something I want on my side, but just I
So
want you to slip and fall.
in ancient Sumeria, war itself was actually often called the dance of Inanna.
Oh,
Bad
Yeah.
ass.
super badass.
Sounds like something straight out of fucking Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, the dance of Inanna.
Mhm.
Like that could totally be like a magic card too.
That sounds like a fucking magic card. It
Yeah.
really does. Like probably an enchantment.
Sounds like that ceremonial war dances they used to do in her name might have been a lot deadlier than I was imagining at first.
Oh yeah, like I was kind of imagining it because like these are priests that are doing them or priestesses. So I would imagine it to be kind of like the haka, where it's like very intimidating and it's powerful,
But
but
aggressive.
it's not
very energetic.
it's not actually fighting, and you're because they wouldn't have been involved in the actual conflict or battle. So I think it would have been just more like they were like doing this extremely like powerful conscious dance to like incite the power like magic and things, you know, to like incite that power in their warriors.
I think that's that makes a lot of sense because I feel like there's a lot of cultures that do things like that. Like we hear about like natives, rain dance and war dances and things like that, and how like it's very energy driven, and like you mentioned the Maori haka is definitely like a very like energy driven like to a certain extent aggressive.
Yeah.
You know. Um,
Well, and I think like it's so much like humans feed off of each other so much, even if it's totally unconsciously, that like in those like dances and whatnot, that everyone kind of feeds off the energy being built by the dance, you
like
know,
being at
and
a
so
fucking
it's like
show.
yeah, absolutely. Like
Yeah.
that mosh pit starts right next to you. Like
Mhm.
even if you don't join in, like you're gonna feel that energy and be like built up by it.
Or if the vocalist jumps into the crowd, kind of thing.
You
Oh, yeah.
You know, like
feel the energy of
that you vibe off that. Like
Mhm.
that's awesome.
Yeah.
One more time, it's the Cult of Ishtar or Inanna.
Yeah.
It only took me 45 minutes, but I got it.
Got it.
That time's a charm, but
We at least learned one thing.
You get
I learned one
rewarded
thing.
with sex after a hard day of work.
That's exactly it.
so not all religions are bad.
Yeah.
But yeah, I really like the idea of bringing like hearing about the mythology. Like I love mythology.
Oh,
so
me too.
I'm glad that this week I learned about definitely mythology I didn't know, but also from a religious polytheistic
Pantheon.
pantheon.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, this was actually a pantheon that I'd never even like officially heard of, and it's interesting because like I because of doing the Lilith episode as the first episode, I knew a little bit about the demon pantheon, like the demonic side of this, but I didn't actually know anything about the gods or goddesses. So that's pretty interesting.
Oh, it certainly is.
Cool.
It's really cool.
I feel like it also has to do with history and religion, where a lot of them also
They all
relating to this.
intertwine
Yep,
so
exactly.
much.
Very much
Yeah,
related to
it's crazy.
It all really does. Even like when she's stuck in the underworld, it takes 3 days.
Oh, 3 days is a fucking
Doesn't
thing.
that keep
That is
it goes
totally a
everywhere?
thing.
Like yeah. So
Yeah.
you definitely see a lot of similarities to
Through-
so many different things.
Totally,
Yeah.
that's so true. Um, but yeah, fucking,
Fuck yeah,
that's
Ishtar.
pretty interesting.
Yeah, I thought that one was really good. So thanks for tuning in and listening to us talk about the cult of Inanna and Ishtar. And have a great rest of your day.
Later.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed that, you can find us on social media by searching Tenacious V's podcast. We're on Spotify, YouTube, Podbean, Twitter, Patreon, Instagram, and Facebook. As always, this episode was written and recorded by Nona. This one was also spoken by Will and Johnny. All of the musical contributions were done by Staple Milk. Come back soon for some more mysteries.